On the 4th of June, 1978, two men riding motorcycles deep into the Plumas National Forest stopped at a Forest Service trailer that should have been empty. They broke a window to get in. Inside they found a man who had starved to death, 19 miles from his car, in a room stacked with enough tinned food to last a year. He had not opened most of it. There were matches in the trailer and paperback books that would have burned. There was a propane tank outside and a working stove. He had lit nothing. He had wrapped himself in 8 bed sheets, one over another, and stayed there while the temperature outside went below freezing night after night. His name was Ted Weiher. 3 months earlier he had been at a basketball game with 4 friends, 50 miles away and 4,000 feet lower, in a town with streetlights. All 5 of them got into a car that night to drive home. None of them arrived. 4 of the 5 were eventually found, spread across a mountain none of them had any reason to be on. The 5th has never been found at all. And the single question that has hung over this case for nearly 50 years is not how they died. It is why the car went up the mountain in the first place. This is one of the strangest missing persons cases in American history, and it is strange in a specific way. There is no shortage of evidence. There is a car, a route, a witness who was on that road the same night, a building full of untouched supplies, and a set of physical facts that every investigator agrees on. The facts are not in dispute. It is that no explanation fits all of them at once. So this film is going to do it the slow way. Who they were, what they did that night, exactly what was found and where, what the one witness said, and then the 3 explanations people have argued about since 1978, and precisely which fact each one fails to account for. Start with the men, because almost every retelling of this case gets them wrong. They are usually described in a way that makes them sound helpless. They were not. All 5 lived in and around Yuba City, in the flat farmland of the Sacramento Valley. All 5 had intellectual disabilities or a psychiatric diagnosis. And all 5 held down routines that most people would recognize: jobs, chores, savings, a bus pass, a place they had to be on a Tuesday. They played for a team called the Gateway Gators, run through a local program for adults with disabilities. Basketball was the center of the week. They practiced. They kept score. They cared about winning, and on the 24th of February 1978 they had a reason to care more than usual. There was a tournament the next morning in Rockland, and the winners went to the state finals. Jack Madruga was 30. He had served in the Army, he worked, and he owned the car, a 1969 Mercury Montego, turquoise, and by every account the most important object in his life. People who knew him were unanimous on one point, and it becomes important later: he did not let anyone else drive it, and he did not take it anywhere rough. Bill Sterling was 29 and the sociable one, the organizer, the one who rang people. Jack Hewitt was 24 and the youngest, still living with his parents, who spoke to him every day. Ted Weiher was 32, tall, quiet, and worked at a cannery. And Gary Mathias was 25. He is the one the case tends to orbit, so it is worth being careful. He had served in the Army in Germany, where drug use triggered episodes that led to a discharge. He was later diagnosed with schizophrenia. By 1978 he was living with his mother and stepfather, taking his medication, holding a gardening job with his stepfather, and doing well. His family described that year as the best he had been in a long time. That is the group. 5 adults, 1 car, a game in Chico about 50 miles north, and a tournament the next morning that they were determined not to be tired for. It is worth pausing on what the tournament meant, because it is the thing that makes every version of that night harder to explain. Winning in Rockland would have sent the team to the state finals. They had talked about it for weeks. Bill Sterling had arranged the lift. Everyone involved was clear that the whole point of the evening was to get home and sleep. And they were careful about it in a way that matters. They had agreed they would not stay out. Ted Weiher's mother expected him back that night and had made him a sandwich for later. Jack Hewitt told his parents when he would be in. These were men who told people where they would be, and who had a reason to be somewhere at 8 the next morning. One more thing about 1978, because it changes what being missing meant. No mobile phones. No way to call from a mountain road. If your car stopped where theirs stopped, your options were to wait for someone to come along a road that almost nobody used in February, or to walk. That is the whole decision tree available to them that night. They drove up to Chico in the afternoon and watched the game at the university gymnasium. Nothing about the evening was unusual. Afterwards they stopped at a shop on the way out of town and bought snacks, soft drinks, sweets, milk. The receipt survived. It is timed at about 10 in the evening. From that shop, the road home to Yuba City runs south. It is a straight, flat, well-lit run of about 50 miles down the valley, a route all of them had taken many times. Bill Sterling had told his family he would be back that night. Jack Hewitt's parents were expecting him. Ted Weiher's mother left the porch light on. Instead the mercury turned east, then north, and began to climb. The Oroville-Quincy Highway leaves the valley and goes up into the Plumas National Forest, a mountain road, unlit, in February, with snow on it. They drove roughly 70 miles the wrong way, gaining thousands of feet, until the car came to a stop on a forest road far past the last house. Nobody has ever produced a reason for that turn. Not a wrong exit, not a shortcut, not a known destination. The road they took does not lead anywhere any of them had a connection to. It leads up. When they did not come home, the families started calling that night. By morning it was a police matter, and the initial assumption was the ordinary one, 5 men, 1 car, somewhere between Chico and Yuba City. Officers searched the valley route. There was nothing on it, because they had never been on it. For those 4 days the search was in the wrong place, and there was no reason for it to be anywhere else. 5 men had left Chico heading south. Police checked the valley road, the hospitals, the bars, the routes a car might leave. Nobody looks 4,000 feet up a mountain for men who were driving home across flat farmland. The families did what families do. They rang everyone. They drove the route themselves, in daylight, more than once. Ted Weiher's mother kept the porch light on for months. Jack Hewitt's father began learning the mountain roads, which is a detail that becomes hard to read about later. 4 days later, on the 28th of February, a Forest Service employee found the Mercury Montego parked on a snow-covered road in the Plumas National Forest, near a place called Rogers Cow Camp. It was 70 miles from where anyone had been looking. Everything about the car argues against every simple explanation, so take the details one at a time. It was not crashed. There was no damage. It was not in a ditch or off the road, it was sitting on the road surface, pointing the way it had come, as if it had been parked. It was not out of fuel. There was roughly a quarter of a tank left, enough to get back down the mountain and a good distance beyond. It was not mechanically broken. When it was recovered, it started and drove. And it was not stuck in any way that 5 adults could not have handled. The snow at that spot was shallow enough that the car was later driven out under its own power. Inside, there was no sign of struggle, no blood, no damage. Some of the food they had bought in Chico was still there. The windows were up. And here is the detail that has kept people arguing for decades: the men had left the car and walked away from it, uphill, into the dark, in February, wearing what they had worn to a basketball game. None of them was dressed for a mountain. Light jackets, ordinary shoes. Between them they were carrying almost no money. And the one thing every person who knew Jack Madruga said, over and over, was that he would not have driven that car up there, and if it had somehow got up there he would not have left it. There is one more thing about the car, and it is genuinely unexplained rather than merely odd. The keys were never found. Not in the car, not on the road, not with any of the men. Whoever last had them took them, and they have never turned up. Which brings us to the only person who can place anyone on that road that night, and his account is so strange that it would be easy to dismiss, except that everything checkable in it checks out. His name was Joseph Shans. He was 55, and on the evening of the 24th he had driven up that same road for an ordinary reason. He was planning a family trip and wanted to see how far up the snow line was. About 5 miles past where the mercury would later be found, his car got bogged in the snow. While he was trying to free it, he had a heart attack. He got back into the car, ran the engine for warmth until the fuel was gone, and then lay there in the cold, in and out of consciousness, waiting for morning. And this is what he said he saw. At some point in the night he saw lights further down the road, torches, moving. He heard voices. He said he heard a woman's voice, and he said he heard what sounded like a baby crying. He saw the shape of a vehicle with its lights on, and figures near it. He called out for help. He said the lights went out. Nobody came. He stayed in the car through the night, and in the morning he walked several miles back down the road to a lodge and got help. He mentioned the lights and the voices at the time, before anyone knew 5 men were missing, and before the mercury was found. The timing works. The place works. His car and theirs were found within a few miles of each other on the same road. The women and the baby have never been accounted for, and no other group was ever placed on that road that night. Shans died in 1990 without ever changing his account. Before we get to the search, look at the walk itself, because the numbers are worth holding. From the car to the trailer is 19.5 miles of forest road, climbing. In February that road is snow-covered. It was dark. They had eaten a bag of shop food some hours earlier and had nothing else. 19 miles is not a wrong turn. It is not a panic. It is many hours of deliberate walking, in the cold, in the dark, in the wrong shoes, uphill, with the option of turning round available the entire time. Whatever was in their heads that night lasted the whole distance. And they passed things. That road is not empty. There are other Forest Service structures along it, and the trailer they eventually reached was not the first shelter on the route. Which means either they did not see the others in the dark, or they did not stop at them. The search that followed was large. Sheriff's deputies, Forest Service crews, aircraft, volunteers, and later snowcat teams went over the area around the car. They found nothing. Not a footprint that led anywhere, not a dropped jacket, not a body. There is an ordinary reason for that. It snowed heavily in the days after they disappeared, and anything on the ground was buried within a week. But it meant that for 3 months the case simply sat. The families waited. The theories that fill a vacuum began to fill this one. And then in June the snow went, the forest roads opened, and 2 men on motorcycles rode up to a Forest Service trailer 19.5 miles beyond where the car had stopped. The trailer was a Forest Service unit left in the mountains for road crews to use in summer. It was locked up and stocked. Inside were shelves of tinned and dehydrated rations, by the estimate given at the time, enough food to keep more than a dozen men alive for a year. There was bedding. There were paperback books. There were matches. Ted Weiher was on one of the bunks, wrapped in 8 bed sheets, one layered over another. He had been dead for a long time. He had grown a beard several weeks long. He had lost an enormous amount of weight, by some estimates close to half his body weight. His feet were severely damaged by frostbite. He had died of starvation and exposure, and he had taken weeks to do it. Now hold that against the room he was in. Of all that food, only a small fraction had been opened, on the order of a dozen tins. The matches were there and unused. The books were there and unburned. Outside there was a propane tank, and inside a stove that would have run off it. No fire had been lit in that trailer at any point. A man starving to death over several weeks, in freezing temperatures, in a room containing a year of food, heat he did not use, and light he did not make. That single set of facts is the reason this case is not filed as 5 men who got lost. There are 2 readings of it and both are uncomfortable. One is that Ted Weiher could not do those things, that his hands and feet were too badly frostbitten by the time he arrived to work a match or a can opener, and that what little he ate was open for him. The other is that he did not know how, and that the person who had been opening tins for him stopped coming. Because someone else had been in that trailer. Candles had been burned down. Some tins had been opened and eaten from. And Ted Weiher's shoes were gone, he had none on and none were in the room. What was in the trailer was a pair of shoes belonging to Gary Mathias. The straightforward reading of that is hard to avoid and impossible to prove. At some point Gary Mathias put on Ted Weiher's shoes, left his own, and walked out of that trailer. Where he went, and whether he was going for help or going away, is the exact center of this case. Once the trailer was found, the search restarted properly and the rest of the men were located over the following days, strung out along the route between the car and the trailer. Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were found within a few miles of the trailer, along the road. Both had died of exposure. Their remains had been scattered by animals over the months they lay there, which is why the sequence of what happened to each man cannot be reconstructed with any confidence. Jack Hewitt was found further out. Part of the search was done by the families themselves, and it was Jack Hewitt's own father who found his son's remains. There is nothing to add to that sentence. Gary Mathias has never been found. There have been searches since, including ones using modern methods, and the terrain has been gone over repeatedly. No trace of him has ever been recovered, no remains, no clothing, nothing. He is the only one of the 5 who is still, formally, a missing person. Line the physical facts up in a row and they refuse to make a shape. A car that worked, abandoned on a road none of them had a reason to be on. Keys that vanished. 5 men walking uphill in the dark, in February, past the point where turning back was survivable. A witness who heard a woman and a baby. A trailer full of food where one of them slowly starved. And a pair of swapped shoes. So here are the 3 explanations that have been argued over since 1978. None of them is proven. Each one accounts for most of the facts and then breaks on a specific one, and it is worth being precise about where each breaks. The first and simplest, they got lost. One theory holds that they took a wrong turn out of Chico in the dark, kept going because the road kept going, and by the time it was obviously wrong they were too far up to reverse safely. The car then stopped in snow, and they set out on foot to find help. It explains the route. It does not explain what happened next. When the car stopped they were roughly 20 miles from the nearest occupied building in the direction they had come, and they walked the other way. It also does not explain why the car, which could be driven, was left with its keys removed, or why men who wanted help walked past the point where help was. The second, that something happened inside the group. Some believe Gary Mathias suffered a psychiatric episode that night and that the others followed him or were led by him. There is no evidence for it. He had been stable for a long time, he was taking his medication, and his family and employer were clear on that. And there is a fact that cuts hard against the simple version of this theory. Gary Mathias was the one member of the group with military training and experience in cold country. If anyone in that car knew that you stay with the vehicle, it was him. The theory needs him to be the person who led 4 men away from shelter, while also being the person most likely to know not to. The third, that they were frightened of something or someone. Some believe they were run off their route, or followed, or that they saw something on that road and left the car deliberately to get away from it. This is where Joseph Shans's account gets pulled in, the other vehicle, the torches, the voices that were never identified. The problem with that one is the opposite of the first. It explains the abandoned car and the walk into the dark, and it explains why nobody flagged down the one vehicle they could see. It explains nothing about the 4 months that followed, about a man surviving weeks in a stock trailer without lighting a fire, and about no one ever coming forward. There is a fourth idea that gets less attention and fits more of the middle of the story than people expect, that they stopped to help. Joseph Shans was on that road, stuck, with his engine running and his lights on, in obvious trouble. A group that saw a stranded car might have parked, got out, and gone up to it on foot. That would explain the parked car, the walk uphill, and why they left the road they knew. It would explain why Sean saw torches and heard voices near a vehicle. It would not explain why they then kept going for 19 miles instead of turning round, and it does not explain the woman and the baby. Sean was alone. There is one more thread that is usually left out, and it belongs here because it is the closest thing to a lead the case ever had. In the weeks after the disappearance, before the bodies were found, several people reported sightings of men matching the group in the Marysville and Yuba City area, including a report of a man resembling Gary Mathias. None was ever confirmed. All of them collapsed under checking. There was also a claim, years later, that Gary Mathias had been seen alive. It has never been substantiated. His family continued to search, and his mother spent the rest of her life on it. In 2019, investigators exhumed remains found in the area for DNA comparison. They were not his. It is also worth saying plainly what this case is not. There is no evidence of a crime. No one has ever been charged, no suspect has ever been publicly identified, and the sheriff's office has never treated it as a homicide investigation. Every version of this story that involves a killer is somebody's theory, not a finding. And it is not the same as the case it is always compared to. At Dyatlov Pass, the tent was cut open from inside and the group scattered downhill, away from shelter, in a way that has a physical explanation people can model. Here the group walked 19 miles towards shelter, reached it, and then one of them starved inside it. The shapes are not the same. What is left, when you take away everything that cannot be supported, is a small and stubborn set of facts. 5 men left a basketball game intending to be home that night and in Rockland the next morning. Their car went 70 miles in the wrong direction and stopped on a mountain road it had no business being on. They left it while it still worked, and walked uphill in unsuitable clothing. One of them reached shelter and died there slowly. 3 died on the way. 1 is still missing. The Yuba County Sheriff's Office has never closed it as anything other than unexplained. No crime has ever been established. No suspect has ever been named. And the physical evidence has been examined repeatedly by people who badly wanted it to resolve into something, and it has not. What makes this case sit differently from most is who it happened to. 5 men who were, by the standards their families used, doing well, working, playing, planning a Saturday morning. The reason it still gets talked about is not that it is spooky. It is that the people who knew them best could never make the last night of their lives fit the men they knew. If you have a reading of it that accounts for the keys, the shoes, and the unlit stove all at once, put it in the comments. That combination is where every theory I have seen comes apart. And if you want the case this one is always compared to, the Dyatlov Pass film is on the channel. This has been the last coordinate.